David's life begins here, the small town of Bethlehem in a tiny kingdom called Israel, surrounded by hostile enemies. But by the end of David's life, this poor shepherd boy will grow the kingdom from this to this. And how he does it is one of the greatest stories ever told. He was the youngest of his brothers, so he stayed home to watch the family's sheep while his older brothers left to join King Saul's army to fight for Israel at the Valley of Elah, a real place you can actually visit today. The people of Israel had a giant problem. No, I mean like a problem with an actual giant. A guy almost twice the size of an average man was sent from the city of Gath to lead an invasion against Israel. These enemies were called the Philistines, and they lived in this region here. I'm going to explain why the Philistines wanted to destroy Israel so bad, and why the Bible says that there were actually multiple Philistine giants living in the land, because the reasons are pretty shocking. But first, David's life was about to change dramatically because of snacks. Yeah, his dad Jesse sent David to his brothers to give them some snacks, because when you're fighting a war, sometimes you need a snack break. But when David got there, he was pretty upset. Goliath was cursing the God of Israel, but Israel's soldiers were too afraid to fight him. So David, a humble shepherd boy, did what he's probably known for the most. By the power of Almighty God, he defeated Goliath with just a sling and a stone. And this is just the first giant David defeated, by the way. When the men saw that God had given David victory over Goliath, they chased the Philistines back to their own land. You would think King Saul would be happy about this victory, but as he made his way back to his home in Gibeah, something happened that really got under his skin. The young women came out singing and dancing to the tune of a new song they had created. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. This made the king so jealous that the next day he tried to kill David with a spear, twice. Yeah, I think Saul had a bit of a temper problem, but it was actually more than that. Not too long ago, Saul had sinned against God multiple times, which caused God to take the kingdom away from him and give it to someone else. The problem was that Saul didn't know who this someone else was until the whole giant thing. He could see that God was with David, and it really freaked him out. So he devised a plan to get David killed. He knew that David and his daughter Michal were in love, so he made David a dangerous offer. Bring me 100 Philistine foreskins, and I'll let you two lovebirds get married. Yes, this is in the Bible. And yes, it's super gross if you think about it for too long. So David went into Philistine land and didn't just bring back 100 foreskins. He brought King Saul 200. Ah, the romance. But King Saul was still jealous and again tried to spear David to death. But what made Saul really angry was that even his own son Jonathan had aligned himself with David. So David escaped to Ramah to one of the only people he could trust, the prophet Samuel. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but years ago, after God took the kingdom away from Saul, Samuel had secretly visited David's home in Bethlehem to anoint him as king, despite being the youngest of 8 brothers. This was a secret that only Samuel and David's family knew about. But Saul was now suspicious, which is why he followed David to Ramah. But as he was on his way, something really strange happened. It appears that God caused him to fall into some kind of trance that made him take off all of his clothes, and apparently it made some people think he was a crazy prophet. This allowed David to escape and flee to the last place King Saul would think to look, Philistine territory. In fact, he went to the giant Goliath's hometown, Gath, in hopes that no one would recognize him. Yeah, that didn't work. The people immediately brought David to the king of Gath and told the king that he was the great warrior who killed so many of their men. But David was smart and immediately tried to trick the king into thinking he wasn't who the people of Gath said he was. He pretended to be mentally deranged, even foaming at the mouth. And it worked. The king thought he was so crazy he kicked David out of his presence. So David went to plan B, a cave called Adullam in central Israel. Archaeologists believe they have identified the location of where this cave is located in Israel today. And it's here that something pretty cool happens. 400 men came to David, most of whom were super late on their taxes to King Saul and followed him to Moabite territory. I guess us Americans weren't the first to join a rebel army to avoid paying taxes. Here, David begged the Moabite king to let his family stay there so they would be safe from King Saul, then took his men to hide in a forest near his hometown. Meanwhile, King Saul was out for blood, to the point that he even started killing priests for the crime of just giving David some bread. But one of them escaped and told David. While Saul was becoming consumed with his own jealousy, David, who already had his own problems, took his men to defend the city of Keilah against a Philistine attack. This was the moment that these disgruntled tax cheaters became warriors. But Saul immediately heard about it and took the biggest army he had to take David out. This left David with a couple of options. Number one, he could stay in the city of Keilah in hopes that the people would help protect him out of gratitude for, saving their lives and all. Or number two, he could flee to the wilderness. Most people would make a simple pros and cons list or have a panic attack, but not David. Instead, he did something that most people in Israel at the time would have considered to be an abomination. He asked the priests who had escaped from King Saul to give him his priestly garment called an ephod. This special garment would have looked like this and was supposed to only be used by the official priests of Israel. But David put this holy garment on himself and asked God what he and his men should do. And God told David to flee ASAP. The fact that God approved of David wearing this priestly ephod is actually a way bigger deal than most people think. You'll see why in a moment, but first, David and his men arrive at the caves of En-Gedi. King Saul hears of it and gathers 3,000 soldiers to hunt him down. En-Gedi was the perfect place to hide because not only are there plenty of caves here, there's also waterfalls good for drinking and lots of wild animals good for eating. I've actually been here myself and am planning a trip back, but this time I'm taking you with me. There's nothing that makes the Bible come to life more than actually being in the exact locations these amazing Bible stories took place. But I'm only taking a small group because I really want to have the chance to be able to interact with everyone on the trip on a more personal level. So if you're interested in being the first to hear when these signups go live, I'll leave a link below for you to get on the Israel Tour email list. When Saul and his men show up here in En-Gedi to look for David, Saul had to go number 2, but there weren't any bathrooms, so he went inside one of the caves. And don't ask me how, but somehow David was able to cut a piece of Saul's robe while Saul was relieving himself. David could have killed his enemy Saul, but he didn't, and his reason for doing so was pretty interesting. He said, "I will not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed." This word anointed is the Hebrew word Messiah or Christ in the Greek. This is going to be very important to our story in a moment. But first, Saul was so moved by David's humility that he took his army and went home. It was at this time that the prophet Samuel died in Ramah. David then took his men and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Here, David married a woman named Abigail, who helped him avoid a war with her husband Nabal, who God struck down with disease. It's a whole story you should definitely check out in the book of 1 Samuel. David then took his men to the wilderness of Ziph, where he spared the life of King Saul and his men a second time. Now, realizing that Saul would never give up hunting him, David tried a second time to hide himself with Israel's arch enemies, the Philistines. This time, he took 600 men with him. Whether it was fear or just having a mutual enemy, the king of Gath accepted David into his land and gave him the city of Ziklag. This was a big deal because the Philistines hated the Israelites for a reason you'll learn about in a moment. But David proved himself to be their friend, at least for the moment, by going to battle with his men against their enemies to the south. He defeated the Amalekites along with many other difficult to pronounce kingdoms. But then the Philistines were getting ready to fight another enemy, the Israelites, here. I'm not even going to pretend to know what David was thinking as he took his men to fight against his own people with the Philistines, but we know that at the last minute, the other Philistine kings denied David from joining their army. They were worried David would turn on them in battle. He wouldn't have been the first Hebrew to turn on them after appearing to be friendly. Most don't realize this, but only 50 years prior, another Israelite warrior had spent time in Philistine territory, and by the power of God, destroyed one of their most holy temples to the god Dagon. Samson was the main reason the Philistines had lost so much, and they were looking for vengeance. But what about all these giants living among the Philistines? Don't worry, we're getting there. So David and his men started to head back, but little did they know that something terrible was happening back at their home in Ziklag. Remember when David invaded the Amalekites? Well, they obviously weren't happy, so they invaded Ziklag, kidnapping the wives and kids of David's army. So by God's guidance, David led his men into Amalekite territory, fought the kidnappers, and got their families back. But not only that, they invaded more Amalekite territory and took back lots of treasure that David distributed to various cities within Israel. Meanwhile, while David and his men were having victory, Saul and his men were losing bad. The Philistines had pushed them back to Mount Gilboa, where King Saul and his sons died. The Philistines expanded their territory that day. So now that King Saul was dead, David was no longer a fugitive of his own people, but now he had some new problems. Israel now had more enemies than ever, but rather than the kingdom of Israel unifying under David as king, King Saul's lead general Abner took Saul's crown and made one of King Saul's remaining sons, Ishbosheth, the new king of Israel in the northern city of Mahanaim. So God told David to go to the city of Hebron, the same city that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried many, many years ago. Here, the tribe of Judah made David king over their territory, and as you might have expected, civil war broke out between the divided kingdoms, until finally, after 2 years of war, Ishbosheth was taken out and both sides were united under King David when he was only 30 years old. David had gone from being an outcast shepherd to becoming the king of the nation. But now he had some work to do, and the first item on the list was to take the city of Jebus from the Jebusites, which was renamed Jerusalem. Here, David built a house and made Jerusalem Israel's capital city. Meanwhile, the Philistines heard that David, who was once their friend, was now king of all Israel. But instead of seeking peace, they gathered their army and closed in on David just west of Jerusalem. But by God's guidance, David took his men and drove the Philistines back as far as the city of Gezer. King David was just getting started. He was about to face some more giants. But first, David did something pretty incredible that most people miss when they're reading this account in the Bible. Remember when King Saul was chasing him, David put on that priestly garment called an ephod to seek God? This time, David was wearing one to make sacrifices as he brought the Ark of the Covenant, Israel's most holy possession, into Jerusalem. David was not only assuming the office of king over Israel, but he was also assuming the office of priest over Israel as well. Only one other person in history had God allowed to be both a king and a priest in Israel, and only one other person will be able to do it in the future. The first priest king was named Melchizedek, and he lived during the time of Abraham. And the last priest king, well, we'll talk about him in a minute. But first, David had some more giants to slay. Okay, so why were there so many giants in Philistine territory? And why did giants exist at the time at all? The truth is, these giants weren't exactly Philistines per se. They were descendants of something much more evil. The Bible tells us in Genesis that before the flood, fallen angels rebelled against God by having children with human women. These children grew up to be giants called Nephilim, who were cruel warriors possessed by evil. This was one reason God had to wipe them out with a flood. But just like lots of other evil deeds continued after the flood, so did the creation of the Nephilim. In David's time, they referred to these giants as the Rephaim, or the sons of Anak, and Goliath was one of them. Many years before David, God used Joshua to destroy most of these evil warriors, but not all. The Bible says in the book of Joshua that many of them remained in the land of the Philistines. David had taken out one of them, but now it was time to finish them off. So he took his mighty men into Philistine territory, fought the giants and the Philistines, and claimed it for Israel. But the Philistines weren't the only wicked enemies of Israel. There were 5 more enemies, and the 5th one was an enemy David probably never saw coming. Next on the list were the Moabites. These were the descendants of an unholy relationship between Abraham's nephew Lot and Lot's own daughter. They were a people who offered their own kids to idols and had a history of persecuting Israel. So David and his men went in and defeated them, growing the kingdom of Israel. I mean, after beating a nation full of giants, this one must have been a walk in the park. But the next enemy, Zobah, actually teamed up with their neighbors Syria to fight against David's attack. Once again, God helped David and his men have victory over Zobah, but the Syrians would have to wait because a king had just passed away. The king of Ammon, who had shown David kindness in the past, was now gone, and his son reigned in his place. So David sent some servants to comfort the new king since his father had just passed. But instead of receiving David's servants, the new king shamed them by shaving off their beards and cutting off the bottom half of their robes so their you-know-what was showing. So David sent his general named Joab to come against the Ammonites. But as he did this, the Ammonites called the Syrians from the north to come help them. The Israelites were now surrounded by both the Ammonites and the Syrians. So Joab told his army to split up so they could attack both enemy armies. But when they did, something amazing happened. Israel started by attacking the Syrians, who became so afraid they retreated. And when the Ammonites saw the Syrians retreat, they were afraid too and did the same thing. But the Syrians sent reinforcements. When David heard about it, he gathered all the men of Israel, crossed the Jordan River, fought the Syrians at Helam, and defeated them. Once again, David and his men were victorious. Now all they had to do was defeat their final enemy, the Ammonites. But David let Joab take his army to finish them off while he went back to his home in Jerusalem. And it's here, after all this great victory, that our hero proves he is not some godlike legend, but a man, just like you and me. He was hanging out on his roof when he spotted a woman taking a bath, whose name ironically was Bathsheba. That makes it easy to remember. So David had her brought to him, and he slept with her, and she got pregnant. The problem was that she was a married woman, and her husband was at war with Joab against the Ammonites. Long story short, David committed probably one of the worst sins recorded in the entire Bible. He had Bathsheba's husband accidentally killed on the battlefield, so no one would find out about his sin. That obviously didn't work out for him, since we're talking about it 3,000 years later, halfway around the world. The sad part is that this began a series of hardships for David, starting with a very unlikely final enemy. This will be David's toughest challenge by far and will almost destroy the entire kingdom. After David took some men to finish defeating the Ammonites, he returned to Jerusalem victorious. Israel was now the largest it had ever been up until this point and was at peace, when one of his sons, Amnon, from one of David's wives, forced himself on Tamar, the daughter of one of David's other wives. Well, Tamar's big brother Absalom heard about it and was furious, as you might imagine, but David did nothing. I wonder if he didn't punish his son Amnon because he felt too guilty about the sin that he himself had recently committed. So Absalom took it upon himself to take vengeance against his brother Amnon all the way up at Hazor so that he could easily flee to Geshur from his dad, the king. But after 3 years, David had Joab bring his son back home. The problem, though, is that David didn't really treat his son the same after that. So Absalom came up with a plan to sway all of Israel to follow him instead of his dad, and it worked. So David went up with some loyal men to the Mount of Olives and wept, the same place another rejected king will go to weep one day. But Absalom chased David and his men all the way to Mahanaim across the Jordan River. David's men and Absalom's army went to war until David's son was taken out by David's general Joab. In sadness, David returned to Jerusalem to another rebellion. A guy named Sheba knew the kingdom was weak and convinced the north of Israel to follow him instead of David. But David's general Joab was able to chase him all the way to a city called Abel and ended Sheba's career. But the story of David doesn't end with some great victory. Oh sure, the kingdom of Israel was bigger than ever and mostly at peace. But instead, David's story ends with another great sin he commits. It ends with him on the top of a hill, which will later become the place God's temple will be built. David is making a sacrifice for the sin of not trusting God and counting the people when God clearly told him not to. The first half of David's life looked like David could be the anointed one, the Messiah who would usher in the everlasting kingdom promised to his ancestor Abraham. But although he was a great king, his life ended in faithless disobedience to God. But there will be a king who will come 1,000 years after David. He will be born in Bethlehem like David was. He will be hunted down by the current king like David was. And he will be a priest king like David was, except this priest will also become the sacrifice for not only David's sin and the nation of Israel, but for the sin of the entire world for all eternity, including you and me. To learn about the life of this king, the true anointed Messiah, who, unlike David, never failed once, check out this video here.